Hi there, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on the new Sport Australian Sport Governance Framework, and particularly on how it can be a useful tool for helping governance in your organization or organizations that you work with these days. Before we get too far into the weeds of the content and the details, I wanted to give you just a little bit of an introduction to myself. I'm Geoff Schoenberg. I've spent over a decade really focusing on sport governance issues through my work as an academic, but also in the last few years, a more involvement in industry. I worked for Sport Australia, where this was actually one of my primary projects, was being the lead author of the new sport governance principles, as well as working with the broader team around developing the whole framework. And that was really part of my goal when I moved out of academia, was to try to get into a position to be able to put the work that I've been doing, the theory, the knowledge, the understanding of sport governance into more practice. Recently, at the start of this year, I relocated to Toronto. I can tell you that relocating in the middle of the global pandemic was not a purposeful choice, but it's provided some great opportunities. And at this point in time, I am now working as an independent consultant for the Canadian Olympic Committee on a few different projects that they're running as well. In addition to sort of my academic work and my professional work, I've also been a director. I'm currently director of Water Polo Canada, and I've sat on a variety of other boards as well. As part of getting this consulting role up and going, I've also started a company called Eunomia Governance Solutions. And that's a consulting firm and where the focus is on supporting organizations with governance and multi-organizational alignment. Certainly one of the things that we're seeing as a trend in the sports sector right now is that need for a broader consideration of how do organizations work together, and governance can't be constrained to just what happens within our organization. Now, what's the purpose of today's presentation? I really wanted to provide a brief background to the new Sport Australia framework, but the primary importance of this conversation is, I guess, around strategies for how it can be used in practice. It's not going to be a deep dive into the framework content. All that content is fairly publicly available, and you can access it at your leisure at the sportaus.gov.au /governance website. What today will look like is I will do a bit of a background and overview of the framework so that there is a bit of context there, go through some of the three main components of the framework. Then we'll get into some of the strategies about how you can use the framework. And there's many different ways, but these are sort of four that I think can provide practical, useful tools for organizations looking to address governance in their area. At that point, that'll end sort of the me talking to you sort of frame part of the presentation, and we'll shift into some breakout rooms where you can have a sort of a smaller conversation around what you've heard today, and then also brainstorm some questions to bring back to the group for a broader discussion at the end of the webinar. So with that in mind, let's get into it. Let's talk about the new framework and why a new framework. Well, firstly, it was timely. When you look at the Sport Australia governance documents and resources, they were starting to get a little bit aged. The sport governance principles came out in 2012, the mandatory sport governance principles in 2015. Those documents are 8 and 5 years old now. There's a lot of other, lot of growth and thinking in the governance space since those were released, and it was time for a bit of an update. Additionally, developing a new governance framework would help to provide some clarity to what Sport Australia's guidance was on governance. Like I said, they had the sport governance principles. They also had the mandatory sport governance principles. They had a document on unified behaviors. They had a few other different papers and discussion documents on governance, as well as different templates. And this really led to some confusion in the sector at times, where you had people being unsure as to what documents were replacing other documents, which guidance took precedence, what happened when there were contradictions. So by sort of producing and creating a new governance framework, there was an opportunity to bring clarity into the sector. It was also a chance to incorporate new thinking. Some of the more contemporary thinking around governance, things around collaborative governance, value-led governance, behavioral issues, weren't really captured as well as they needed to be to produce that sort of contemporary thinking of governance these days. And finally, it was really important to have a broader reach beyond just the national sport organizations, which were the target of a lot of the Sport Australia's work. That led to issues with different bodies, such as smaller state sporting organizations or clubs, trying to govern in line with these governance principles, which weren't really set up for them. So a new framework was designed to have a broader appeal across the sector. With that in mind, one of the big things and the characteristics of how this framework came to play was sector-led engagement. The process took about 10 months and it involved workshops with executives, with directors in the sports sector, lots of meetings with state governments and the state sport federations, and an iterative process that allowed for feedback on the go to make sure that the documents that were produced were really lining up with what the sector wanted and needed. So with that in mind, let's get into it. What is the governance framework? Why is it being called a framework? It's really important to note it's more than just a code or a checklist or principles. The use of the term framework highlights that the purpose of what's being developed is organizational support and organizational development. In some ways, the framework is very much like the frame of a house. It's something that an organization can build their governance around. The other advantage of this framework is it provides a reference point for consolidating the information that currently exists. As an internal resource, having a framework for Sport Australia means that they can identify gaps more clearly in terms of where they want to be developing further resources or adding potentially new principles or revising principles and standards as in line with the needs of the overall framework, rather than a piecemeal approach, which was part of the problem that was in place before. Ultimately, though, what is the new framework? The new framework consists of three primary parts. There's the governance principles, the governance standards, and the resources and tools. And so I'm going to now go through each of those components not necessarily in detail, but at least to sort of provide a little bit of an overview of what they look like. That's where we'll start our journey today, is talking about the principles. One of the ideas in producing the new principles was to really try to make them applicable to any sport governing body. And to do that, there was a need to make the governance principles more accessible, meaning not just for people who have a deep understanding of governance already, but for people who are new to governance, new club presidents or directors on state sport organization boards, or in our case of Canada, provincial bodies, to be able to really understand what governance is and how these principles might apply to them. There was a need for them to be informative. So rather than just sort of saying, here's what needs to happen, there needed to be some context delivered around that information to help people to understand the principle, rather than just the way many codes or principles are less, just a statement or two, and being left to interpret that to themselves. So you should now have on your screen a view of the sportaus.gov.au/governance website. This is a place where the framework is housed, and you can see that it leads off with the governance principles. Let's look into how the principles are set up. If we scroll down here, and one thing I want to point out is that there's a print version of this as well that you can download into a PDF and for other printing for reading at your leisure, but all the information is the same in the document is in here. So what we can see here, and this is essentially our table of contents. There's a box here called the start line. Now the start line isn't a principle in and of itself. Essentially, it's a governance 101 to help people new to their role as a director, or just new to governance in general. And that's a place that really tries to break down what governance is, what governance is not, starts to introduce some of the terminology and the broader purpose of governance in an organization. After that, you can see there's 9 sport-themed principles. The use of a sport term helps to provide a little bit more of a relatable element to the principles that some found absent in previous things. And it's important to note that there is, and the start line explains this as well, but sport governance is different. And by giving a bit of a sport theme to the principles, that makes sense for the sport environment. And these sort of things include, so you can see the best and fairest, that's all about talking about integrity, and the best and fairest is very much an Australian term there. The defense, that's your risk management. Game plan, that talks about strategy. So these core governance concepts given a bit of a sport theme. As well, there's also a bit here called the game is changing. And similar to where the start line isn't the principle, the game is changing is also not a principle per se, but it's a thought piece, a couple pages of writing to encourage sports to reflect on their fundamental structures, their governance, and their operating models. In many cases, governance structures overall haven't changed much in 100 years. And sport has changed a lot. So it's a place to sort of, it's an excellent spot for federated models, and anybody involved with the federated system, as I'm sure many of our my Canadian compatriots here would be. It's a really insightful piece because a lot of the lessons there apply as well. Now, each principle follows a very similar structure as well. Let's jump into the playbook as an example. So what you can see is you've got a little bit of a theme at the top, board processes, which ensure accountability and transparency. That from there, you have the actual principle itself, a one-sentence statement that sort of says, this is the principle that we're seeking to put into place. After that, there's a list, every principle has this sort of 2 boxes, the benefits of governing according to that principle, and a list of questions to prompt thinking and discussion about the principle. So those are questions you might ask yourself as a director, questions a board might have a conversation about, or ways that a member might go, hold on, is my organization being appropriately governed? Here's some of the things I might ask myself. After that, there's in each principle, there's a bit of text, and that's to provide, that text is to provide more context or just detail examples of the principle in practice. So just to provide a little bit more description to help understand that's the informative piece of each principle. At the end of each recommendation, we see here there's example behaviors and actions. And that's really one of the things that's important about this element, is it's not just saying, here's what the principle is and here's what you need to do, but it's giving clear behaviors or actions that the board as a whole can do, that individual directors can do, that an organization can do, and that a CEO can be doing to sort of take steps towards governing according to this practice. Finally, and this is where they're similar, but it's different, is a set of recommendations. And these recommendations provide a bit of a guideline, again, what would good governance look like according to this principle. So that's sort of the broad structure of each principle. Now I want to take us over to the standards. The sport governance standards, it's important to pull them out as being different than the principles, because these are now a measurement tool. The standards, there's 37 of them in all, have specific expectations of how Sport Australia expects its government-funded national sport organizations to behave and to govern. Now, that said, in many ways, these standards can be used by any organization, but should be interpreted with caution. Smaller organizations may find that the standards don't really match the reality of what they're they can realistically be expected to put into place. And organizations, in some cases outside the Australian context, will find that the standards don't really, may not apply or may not make sense to them. With each of the standards, is a series of measures, and these measures are designed to be outcome focused rather than output or tick box. And that's where, if you go into this print version here, you can bring up, and I've preloaded the principle 4 here. You can see how the standards, so in this case, the board should have a diverse mix of skills, expertise, and experience in order to meet the strategic goals of the organization, is then accompanied by 4 different measures as a bit of an evaluation tool. And those provide, again, a little bit more than just a simple, yes, the board is diverse or not. It talks about some of the other tools that an organization can use. So these standards are designed in a way, and the way they were set up by Sport Australia is that, again, these are for the Australian national sport organizations. But those measurements or those standards, that approach could be adapted to fit whichever organization, if you're a provincial governing body here in Canada, they might provide an option for you there as well to base a modeling of an evaluation tool. The third part of the sport governance framework is the resources. So if we go back into our principles and we go back into principle 6, our playbook, at the end of the document, at the end of the page there's a resources and tools to help. These resources is essentially a place to go, and this is again why having a framework is better than just a series of principles and a list of resources. All these different tools that have been developed either by Sport Australia or some cases adapted from tools other organizations have developed are in one place, tied to a principle, so that you as an organization are able to find valuable tools that you can use to put into place. Now, I'm not going to go through all the different tools there or examples, but you can see there's a list there of what, and some principles have more resources and tools than others, but it's at least a great place for organizations to go if they're going, hey, we need this. Chances are there's a tool or a template available. With that in mind, let's now move back to the strategies of how do we actually, as an organization, use this framework. Before we can start to consider what we're going to do and the strategies we can put in place, we need to also have a reflection on why do we need to put this in place, and what do we have, what are our tools available to implement new governance. So that's where you can see here, it's really important for organizations to consider the purpose of embracing governance change. Is your organization in the midst of a shift from a very much an operating board into a governing board? You're going to use the framework in a different way than if you're an organization which is already governing fairly effectively and looking for different options to improve. It could be a risk management exercise to start to say, okay, we as a board know that we have different obligations. Are we meeting them all? Let's go through and try to make sure that at least our governance is up to speed so that we can put these in place in an effective way. Structures are important as well. And by structures, I'm talking about, in some cases, many organizations might have a governance committee. Well, the framework might be a really good place to sit within the governance committee to look at and to consider and to make recommendations to the board. But some boards don't have a governance committee in place yet, particularly sort of smaller organizations. And so it might have to be the board as a whole considering what the framework looks like, or a subcommittee or a task force could be set up. Resources are really important as well. How much time and money do you have to be able to put into this? Do you have a full-time executive director who has supporting staff and who can therefore really help build out some of the policies and processes that might be needed to build up your governance? Or is this a board that's just trying to scrape by? That's going to impact what strategies you can sort of put in place. And finally, culture. If you have an organization, if your organization is not interested in governance change and you're the sole person trying to advocate for reform, it's going to be very different than if your board is in the sort of situation where everybody agrees we want to be governing better, let's work together. So those are some of the things to think about as I just talk through the next set of strategies on ways you could put these things into practice. We've got 4 strategies listed here, and these strategies are certainly not in any way, shape, or form all-inclusive. There's many different ways, and there's sort of bits that you can take and pull from each one. When we look at these strategies, they're going to be applicable for, again, the different considerations above. So the first one that I've listed there, I've called a principle by principle review. Now, that is for a board that is generally well governed, that is happy with what it's doing, and is looking just to sort of check in on what they're doing. This can take place particularly in organizations that are well governed, that maybe do not have a governance committee to spend a lot of time focusing on governance development, or a governance committee who's tied up with other issues at the time. And the principle by principle review is essentially at each board meeting, whether it's once a month, bi-monthly, or once a quarter, there's an agenda on the item to discuss the principle. Now, in some cases, it's really set up well for you because you can essentially go through the questions to ask and use that as a guiding feature of the conversation in your board meeting. Have the board go around the table, talk about some of those questions that are in place, and identify whether they feel they're meeting the expectations. It's a starting point of a conversation for a board to identify potential development opportunities as well as strengths. One of the things that we often forget about when we're talking about governance is remembering what we do well and ensuring that we continue to do those things. The principle review, one of the issues with taking it that way is that it would take a lot of time. Even if you're meeting monthly and you're doing that on a monthly basis, that's 9 months of conversations before, and there might be change along the way, obviously, but that does take up quite a bit of time. The next item there is governance committee driven. And now governance committee is where the governance committee can sort of take on the response, that similar sort of review process, but rather than drawing it out as a piecemeal of a bunch of board meetings over a period of time, the governance committee could, in many ways, address a lot of these with one likely extended but in-depth committee meeting, certainly over a meeting or 2. From there, the governance committee can look at the principles, have conversations amongst themselves about how well the organization and the board are putting these principles into place, and prepare a set of recommendations or a discussion paper to then bring back to the board with a more specific set of questions for the board to discuss there. The purpose of that is to, again, really, it's a very effective way when the board meetings are already rather tight and fully packed, as most board meetings are, and when potentially a more expedient process is required. If you have the governance committee in place, and even it could be, this is the sort of thing that if you don't have a governance committee, it can be a task force set up to do this over a month or 2 to come back to the board with recommendations. This can be really effective in terms of getting a speedier approach to change when there's an appetite for an organization to either engage in change, or it's a place where we can really start to have, if there isn't an appetite for change, if there's a small collection of people who are interested and willing to try to push change, it's a place for the governance committee to develop a strategy on how to push the broader board or the organization as a whole into governance reform. The third strategy here is standards-based evaluation. And now this is essentially if you're in the position where the sport governance standards in the new framework make sense for you, rather than necessarily having a full discussion in the board on every principle, you can ask each board member to rate the board's performance according to those standards. This can be really insightful from the standpoint that it can highlight either at a high level where the organization may have some developmental opportunities, and again, where the organization is strong. It takes up less time than necessarily a principle by principle review, because it's not, it's something that you can essentially base a conversation off of each person's individual feedback in an evaluation through a coordinated method. It also provides an interesting point when you start to see discrepancies. And that's one of the more interesting things, where if you have a few board members say, oh yeah, we're doing this a 4 out of 4, and a few board members saying, no, this is something we really need to improve, a 1 out of 4, provides a really great discussion point for a board to engage in a discussion about what the board needs to work on, improve, address, or where they see things differently and why that might be. In some cases, again, a lot of people don't necessarily have similar understandings of governance, and this can promote conversation around the board to make sure everybody has a consistent view on how the organization is doing. The final recommendation I have, or strategy that I've listed there, is a resource analysis. And that resource analysis is really about going through the resources listed in the principles and seeing what resources are there and what might be useful for your particular organization. This is not necessarily as comprehensive of a tool as some of the other ones are, because it doesn't necessarily promote as much discussion amongst the board, but it can be a quick way to identify useful and incremental changes within how a board is doing something. For instance, if you don't have a board calendar in place, and if you're not sure what a board calendar is, you go in and you find that, oh, here's a board calendar which gives us a guideline on what month we're going to review our constitution and bylaws. What month are we having a conversation about succession planning? What meeting are we engaging in a review of our performance as a board? Setting up that sort of board calendar, because you've identified it as a resource you don't have, suddenly it's a really quick way to help improve your governance. That's sort of a discussion there based on the strategies we've had in place. And now, so sort of before we move into more of that breakout room and that discussion area, I want to do a bit of a summary because I'm going to end the recording when we move into the breakout rooms so that people in the webinar won't have 10 minutes, or watching the recorded webinar won't have 10 minutes of blank time or anything like that. So really, before we get into the discussion, remember that the governance framework and the Sport Australia approach is really developing a tool for organizational development. The principles are informative and educative to allow organizations to learn from them, to have conversations about them, to improve their governance. The standards do provide a measurement tool which can be useful for government funders or other funding bodies or key stakeholders who want to know how the governance is doing. But those standards really do need to be addressed and customized outside of that Australian National Sport Organization context. It's important that the framework isn't just a band-aid solution. It doesn't have a tick box list of things that you can put into practice. One of the things and one of the drivers of the development of new standards and a new framework was the recognition that for many of the mandatory sport governance principles, the way Australia used them in the past, organizations could score very highly on the mandatory sport governance principles because a lot of them were just sort of output checklist type items. But when you scratch the surface, you recognize that because of either cultural or behavioral issues, governance could be flawed despite necessarily scoring high. The implementation is also it's important to recognize the contextual nature of it. Governance isn't something that is implemented and then done. Governance is an ongoing process that requires regular attention and customization to suit an organization's particular needs. There is no one size fits all for organizational governance. Recognizing what resources you have available, what are the important challenges and or opportunities facing your organization at the moment, those are the critical things to start to go, how can we use this framework to implement in our organization? At this point, I'm going to say thank you to the people who are watching online. I hope you've learned something and encourage you or watching, I guess, the recorded version. Those of you who are attending live will still have another exercise coming forward. But thanks for watching the recorded version, and please reach out to me at jeff@eunomiasolutions.com if you have any questions or want any more information.